Good morning, good evening, and welcome to our first Gateway Security and Threat Hunting webinar. My name is Ben Aylett. I'm the Product Manager at Red Piranha, and I'm very excited today to be joined by our SOC Manager, James Bryn, and Security Analyst, Braden Beaver, and we've also got Raya working in the background to make sure everything runs smoothly. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at how you can use Crystal to protect your network and connected assets, and we'll also look at how to get started with threat hunting. What we'll be demonstrating on this is an internal development release of 4.0. This is our latest XDR platform. We can expect to see the final product released by the end of this month. So by the start of April 2021, everyone with a Crystal appliance will have access to this upgrade, which is a result of 200,000 hours of development over the last 2 years to bring this major redesign to you. Now, a little housekeeping before I hand over to James. You should notice that there is a chat window. So if you have any questions during the event, feel free to use it. This presentation will be replayed a number of times. So if you are watching a replay and you have a question or feedback, you can contact your business development manager directly or our support team at support@redpiranha.net, or you can go to our forums at forum.redpiranha.net to join the conversation with other engineers and members of the Red Piranha team. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll now hand over to James.
Thank you, Ben. It's James here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Let's get started with the Threat Hunting with Crystal webinar. So today I'm going to cover an introduction, why implement protection, how to implement protection, what to be protecting against. Braden Beaver, our security analyst in the Perth office here, will give us a live demo on the Crystal 4.0, and then we'll have a question and answer section at the end. As Ben mentioned, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side. If we see fit to answer those questions during the webinar, then we will do so. Otherwise, we'll answer them at the end. So in this session, we're going to be covering how to protect your network and infrastructure, how to get started with a basic security program, and we have some prerequisite knowledge before we get in. We are under the assumption that you have completed the Crystal Essentials and Crystal Certified Engineer courses. At any point, if we are going over a section or a control that requires the knowledge of Crystal Certified Engineer course, we'll point out in that time where the overlap is. So our demo box is set up at a gateway level. This is important in that the Crystal is able to deal with traffic coming and going, particularly around the protective capabilities. So if you have a Crystal set up on a span port and it's receiving duplicated traffic, then it can detect, but it cannot drop or reject traffic through IDPS. So just keep in mind that we're talking about the Crystal at the gateway. We also have the understanding that you will know how to properly segment your traffic into smaller VLANs or subnets and implement access controls using the principle of least privilege. I'll talk about this a bit more in a moment with regards to the controls that we'll be talking about today. So when we're talking about malware, there's a common standard in the industry thanks to Lockheed Martin, which is called the Cyberkill Chain. So this is 7 different stages of the malware lifecycle. And we have the attacker performing reconnaissance, working out where the targets are, weaponizing a particular piece of code. This will be by adding exploits, payloads, etc. Delivering the malware through phishing or watering hole attacks or malvertising. There's a number of different delivery methods. The exploitation of the systems. So this is running 1-day or 0-day exploits upon systems. The installation of that malware. In some instances, this will be on disk. In others, this will be a fileless or memory-based malware attack. And then we'll traditionally see a command and control. This is a communication between the malware and some server that lets it checks in to say, I've been installed on this system. These are my capabilities, and it provides that two-way communication between the attacker and the malware. And then we see actions on objectives, where's the final state. This is hands on keyboards, the attacker manually using the capabilities of the malware they've delivered to transfer through the network to perform some actions, be it ransoming, encrypting payloads, or performing other attacks that may be destructive or otherwise dangerous. So this is the model we'll be using today to discuss different types of malware. So please keep this in mind while we're talking about this. So why implement protection? The traditional solution of endpoint antivirus is only useful for protecting against a small subsection of its cyber attacks. If I go back to the Lockheed Martin Cyberkill Chain, what we're talking about here is the delivery, exploitation, installation component of that. So this is sitting on the endpoint, and the command and control actions on objectives. This is traditionally at a network layer. The weaponization and reconnaissance, the first two stages, this is done on the attacker side, but we can see reconnaissance activity through the network gateway itself as well. So 65% of local organizations surveyed detected a security incident in 2018. This is obviously increasing year after year. And the important fact here is that this is detected. There are a lot of attacks that go undetected. And without well-implemented protection, it takes on average 206 days to identify a breach and 314 days to contain it. This is through a report from IBM and through Telstra. So specifically, we're talking about attacks that were detected and identified and contained. Those that weren't would be outliers in this survey. So these numbers are reflective of not just the amount of time it takes to respond to an attack, but as a whole in the industry, how well people are able to actually detect and respond to threats. So threats are ever evolving, and your network needs an ever evolving layer of protection. This is where the Eye XDR steps in, and combining this with other services like the eCISO, which is an automated electronic chief information security officer. This gives a greater protection and also greater visibility over how effective the controls are that have been implemented in your network and systems. The technical controls we'll be looking at here are the DNS Insure, the firewall, the IDPS or IDS IPS, gateway scanning, and protocol analysis. So now looking at the OSI layer, the OSI model, the different layers of communication. This is where the Eye sits in communications between host A and host B. We're more or less covering the entire OSI model with so leaving out the physical layer. This is where your network cables are sitting. Obviously, the Eye does provide networking capabilities, but there's no protection at that layer. So moving up the entire chain to application, where we have the endpoint apps, including the CSOC endpoint agent, which is actually able to query the operating system, event logs, registry keys, services, processes, etc., through to network and data link, encryption layers happening at presentation, session layers and TCP, UDP encapsulation happening at that section, and transport. So the Eye is all-encompassing with regards to its protective capabilities. So how to protect your infrastructure. Addressing control insufficiencies in the organization can be a large mitigation for threats. We're talking about introducing Eye and an integrated eCISO service here, so covering soft and technical controls. Having an understanding of where the threats lie, doing analysis of the attack surfaces and the potential attack chains that an attacker might take is a good way to understand where and why you need to implement technical controls. We also have the vCISO service, and this is a more hands-on approach whereby there's less automation, particularly for businesses that have very specific compliance requirements. Think the medical industry, aged care, that sort of thing. Whereas eCISO is directly tied to ISO 27001 and sys controls, vCISO can cover a number of different compliance requirements. So these two services will essentially deliver an amount of advice of security and compliance consulting, and also the documentation requirements that businesses have to level up their security maturity. So identifying the risks that are posed to the network assets, or firstly determining where the assets are, whether they be informational or network assets, particularly network with regards to the technical controls, and then implementing any soft or hard controls to mitigate them. So the timeline here for a business that has more or less no security maturity, though this is a somewhat cyclical ongoing process when there are changes to structure or to what information is being held, or even the network infrastructure itself. The first step would be to appoint a security officer, someone who is in control or responsible for the security and compliance within the organization, be it a top-level executive or a chief information security officer. With regards to our services, this would be either a electronic chief information security officer or a virtual chief information security officer. So this will perform the requirements of making decisions with regards to incidents and documentation, policies, controls, but also presenting those risks to the board and deciding on whether or not to take actions. So the next step then will be to define the approved software. So what we're talking about here is what is needed for day-to-day business operations, what is needed for customers to access your systems or services. So these may be things that are only internal, think ERP solutions, etc., or CRMs. And this may also be externally accessible web applications. But we're also talking about the workstations within the network, standard operating environments, databases, etc. Once we know what we're doing, what we need within the network, we can then identify how we're going to lay that out. What are the hard controls here? So within the Crystal Eye, we're talking about the security detection and response capabilities in DNS Insure, the firewall, IDPS, etc. But we're also talking about network segmentation. So within zones, should a particular user have access to a database? Should the administrative network be segregated from the day-to-day operations network? That sort of thing. So with regards to soft controls, this is our next step here. This is creating the policy and training staff. So work from home policies, bring your own device, password policies, clean desk policies, etc. This will depend on your requirements. This will also depend on the level of maturity of the business. As I said, this is a cyclical process. So if you have requirements to pass particular audits, or for example, ISO 27001, you'll need to show constant improvement between audits. So these things may grow over time, but if the business stays static, if the informational assets and the assets and risks within the business stay the same, then likely these documents will reach a level of maturity which they don't need to be touched for some period of time. And then you also have the training of the staff. So just having the policy isn't enough. The staff need to understand the policy. It needs to be clearly written, not necessarily long and over complicated. It needs to be easily understood, and therefore it has a greater effect. And then finally, we have a system to monitor and control application usage, and also monitor the effectiveness of the soft and hard controls. The Crystal Eye XDR fits in here with eCISO to provide us a dashboard of the effectiveness of controls, whether or not they have been implemented, etc. So we can plot over time the security maturity of a business. Now we're going to look at the top 10 protection techniques. This is with regards to endpoints mostly. There are a couple in here that fit within the network gateway level, but these are mostly tied to the ISM or the ASD's Essential 8, plus a couple of considerations we've given to the most likely attack vectors. So employing the principle of least privilege, as I mentioned before, So we're talking about what does a user need to see or access, and as a result of that, restricting user privileges wherever possible, so that the least minimum that is needed. You don't have an accountant having domain administrator rights unless that is specifically needed as a use case. So understanding where potentially an attacker could utilize an account and where they could go to with that account is highly important, so that if an account is breached, it has a very limited attack surface. So this is delaying the attacker's capabilities as much as possible. Patching operating system vulnerabilities and patching application vulnerabilities. This fits within the update management life cycle. So understanding that while there may be operational considerations and functional considerations with regards to patching operating systems, etc., there is a tradition whereby a system administrator would test Windows updates ahead of time to make sure they don't break anything. But with the rate that these operating system and application updates are being pushed, knowing that there are security patches within these, that timeline needs to be reduced as much as possible, because we have attackers using automated scripts and programs to find, to exploit, and to infiltrate networks that have these vulnerabilities within very short timeframes. And in some instances, this is actually before the patch is made available. So patching is extremely important, and understanding and measuring the effectiveness of your patch management processes is also very important. We have user application configuration hardening. This ties in again to the principle of least privilege. Certain applications, ERP solutions, etc., will have defined roles for users within these applications. And then other endpoint applications, such as word processors, etc., might have the ability to run code. The way that applications are configured with specific flags, etc., will determine whether or not they can be used to pivot, or whether or not they can be exploited externally as part of that attack chain. Email content filtering is another massive one. We see phishing day to day being the cause of the initial breach in a ransomware attack. That too with web content filtering through malvertising, etc. And software-based application firewalls are important for restricting the ability for malware, etc., to pivot throughout the network. Blocking script execution. Again, this ties into that phishing campaign where we see Word documents, etc., that tell you to enable macros. So this can actually be locked down on the endpoint such that the Office solutions are unable to actually run code that may be a payload in a file delivered through a phishing campaign. We have web domain block listing. This ties more into the C2, but also into the delivery components of a malware campaign. So this is employed through things like DNS Insure, whereby we actively monitor the internet for threats, and we feed the IOCs, or the indicators of compromise, in this case the domains, back through to the crystallize of our clients and our own crystallize, to make sure that any connection to known bad domains, either to download a payload or to call out to a C2 server, are blocked. And the backup and restore process, another major one here. Understanding that you have functional backups, understanding that the need to air gap and rotate offsite backups, not just for the sake of stopping an attacker being able to pivot to your backup server and encrypt that in the case of ransomware, but also with regards to disaster recovery. If there is some sort of damage to the building, are you able to bring the business back up? And with regards to compliance, this might mean that you have certain patient or client records that need to be stored for an amount of time. Are you able to meet the legislative requirements by having these offsite in case something does happen? Now we've got some further information here on the top 10 protection techniques. I'm not going to go through each of these because I have already been through them, but if you would like to read further on this, the slides for this webinar will be made available after the webinar. Now, indicators of compromise, I mentioned this just a moment ago. We're talking about any sort of indicator of there being a compromise on the system. So examples here are things like email addresses, domains that I mentioned before, but also metadata related to files. When was it created? Who created it? The hash of the file itself. This is particularly useful for identifying known types of malware. And then things like strings. So unique components of binaries or files. This is traditionally how antivirus solutions work on a string detection. They look for a particular author signature or something unique to that malware in order to detect it. Obviously, connection IPs as well. Quite often we see IP addresses being used in C2 communication rather than domains. But this might also include things like Twitter handles or Bitcoin addresses. There's many different very subtle, small things that can be used to determine whether or not a breach is taking place and also at what stage that breach is. So something like an email address or a Bitcoin wallet, we traditionally see these at the end of a ransomware campaign. So at that point, it's probably too late. But with that in mind, if you see that Bitcoin wallet address on one endpoint, there may be actually a time period whereby you can segregate that machine, isolate it, or unplug it from the network to make sure that ransomware does not spread or does not continue to encrypt machines. So we utilize these IOCs, and we obviously recommend that you do too, to inform your security configurations. So we have here, they're one of the best, or really they are the gold standard of what to be looking out for with regards to compromise. So the web proxy is first of the technical controls that we'll be talking about on the Crystal Eye. Web proxies are extremely important with regards to detecting and mitigating threats. Obviously, a lot of threats come through HTTP, HTTPS communication. So having a web proxy set up allows the gateway device, in this case, the Crystal Eye XDR, to monitor, to scan, and to react to known threats. This is also with regards to things like corporate use or use policy violations. For compliance, is a user going to websites they shouldn't? So the web proxy allows us to provide that functionality. The differences here between transparent and explicit, understanding how to enable proxy rules and define policies, would recommend that you, if you're not aware of this already, that you go through the Crystal Eye Certified Engineer course section on the web proxy. But there are some major changes coming here with Crystal Eye 4.0, particularly around the way we define groups of devices within the network and how we're able to apply different policies to them. So certain use cases here might be public infrastructure in something like a library where you have shared machines. These might be under a tighter web proxy configuration or policy than a machine that is used by administrative staff. Now, something that's come up recently and quite frequently is this DNS over HTTPS. And DNS over HTTPS, or DOH for short, as it's known, is a functionality that allows DNS requests, so what IP address belongs to this domain, to be encrypted and transferred over HTTPS. So as far as an end user is concerned, particularly home users, this adds an extra layer of security, of anonymity to their browsing habits. Particularly with foreign governments and nation state attackers, upline even your ISP. If you're able to hide which domains you're going to, this makes investigation a lot more difficult. So there is a genuine use case for DOH, but typically not within a corporate environment. And one of the major reasons for this is the moment that you enable DOE, you're removing the ability for your gateway to provide some levels of detection and protection through things like domain block listing, because those domain requests are not passing through the gateway's DNS server, and thereby they're not detected. So there are ways, a number of ways to actually disable DOE, depending on what browser is being used on the endpoints. So for Google Chrome, this would be to use the Google Chrome Enterprise tool, whereby you can specify specific configurations. And in there, you're able to disable DOE. This can also be done through Chrome About by modifying that setting. But for mass deployments, we'd suggest using that Chrome Enterprise tool. For Firefox, this can be done using group policy registry key edits. So there's a number of ways that you could apply this to groups of machines or to entire networks through something like group policy, or through a remote procedure call, changing registry keys, etc. So there's examples here of the registry keys for Mozilla Firefox. These will likely differ depending on which version of Windows you're using. Even within Windows 10, there's a number of different releases, and quite often they have registry keys in different locations. So I would suggest, if you wanted to apply this specifically to Firefox, that you do a little bit of research and find out what's going to work best for your network. Now, types of attacks, I've covered a few of these already, or talked about them rather. We see the traditional Trojan, remote access Trojan, or RAT, banking Trojans, ransomware, fileless malware, which is the malware that sits in RAM, thereby making it harder to be detected by endpoint AV. Phishing campaigns, extremely common at the moment. Vulnerability exploitation, again, this is on the rise in the past couple of weeks, I would say, with the release of leaking of a couple of new malware kits that were specifically for the InfoSec industry. So I'd say we're going to see a sudden surge here in vulnerability exploitation, but this is commonly a automated scanning sort of system where ransomware gangs, and particularly people who are access brokers, that is, they break into networks and sell that access onto ransomware gangs that will then deploy that secondary payload, are using scanning systems to mass scan the entire internet, which can be accomplished within a few hours, find all the machines that are reporting a particular version of an application that is known to be vulnerable, and then they will go and attempt to break into all these systems using an exploit for that vulnerability. Malvertising is another one that has, it comes and goes with regards to how effective it is. We quite often see changes to the way browsers implement protection to this, but there is a massive industry around advertising, and thus around malicious advertising. So deploying tracking cookies, but also deploying malicious code and exploits within the frames that deliver these adverts is a way for an attacker to gain system access simply by having a user visit a website, use an application on their phone, or scroll through Facebook or similar. Password attacks refers to things like password stuffing or brute force attacks, whereby known passwords or generic or basic passwords are passed to exposed authentication systems. So moving back to the principle of least privilege and also network segmentation, if you do not expose login systems, the chance of compromise on those is fairly reduced. But password attacks and exposed login portals also can benefit in threat hunting capability through things like honeypots, whereby we can watch to see who's attempting to log in, with what frequency, with what passwords, and we can apply that sort of understanding as IOCs to greater improve our detective and protective capabilities. DDoS, or distributed denial of service, is again fairly common. We're seeing this actually as a second stage to ransomware attacks, whereby someone doesn't pay the ransom, they're then DDoSed off the internet and given another ransom. Either you pay us or you won't be able to access the internet and your customers won't be able to access your website or whatever it might be. Spyware, not as common as it used to be, but looking into the actions taken by a user on the endpoint, this is generally linked to the advertising, marketing, sort of malicious advertising space. Now, I'm going to pass you over to Braden Beaver. He's going to give you a live demo of a few different types of malware and ransomware and how to apply controls on the Crystal Eye and also how to monitor the effectiveness of those.
Good morning, good afternoon,
Thank you, everybody.
Good evening to everybody, wherever you are. In this section, I'm just going to be going over some specific examples of malware, specifically Ryuk, NAT Slip Streaming, which is not malware, it's an exploit, and Cobalt Strike, which is a post-exploitation kit. And I'm going to be going over how to detect and how to protect against those attacks in your Crystal Eye. First off, I'm going to start off with Ryuk, but before that, I'm going to bring everything back to the Lockheed Martin Cyberkill Chain. As I'm going through this, I'm going to be explaining what each of these behaviors of the attacks fall into in terms of the Cyberkill Chain, which sections they fall into, and how we're protecting against each of these sections in relation to these malware or attacks. Okay, so starting off with Ryuk. Ryuk is a ransomware which popped up, I believe, around 2019. Initially, it was quite a primitive malware. It only allowed attackers to, well, it required attackers to manually distribute it through a network. Recently, in 2020, it has developed the capability to spread through the network itself, and even moved recently, within the past few days, it was found to have developed some worm-like capabilities. So first off, with ransomware, the best place we're going to catch it is before it gets onto a system. Once it gets onto a system, it's going to be encrypting the system, and that's not great. How we do that with the Crystal Eye is by detecting the malware coming into our network. The best place to do that would be through the content filter. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a Crystal Eye instance set up here. Okay, so you should be able to see that. This is the newer version of Crystal Eye. It might look slightly different to yours, but you can implement all of this in your current Crystal Eye installation. So the best place to catch ransomware coming into your system would be through the gateway security scanning section. This section allows you to cache files coming into your network very, very briefly on your Crystal Eye and scan these files for malicious file properties known. So say this file was coming into your network. It's a docx file, and it has the file hash that matches ransomware, a ransomware attack. We are able to catch this by scanning the file on the gateway and protecting before it gets into your network and alerting before it gets into your network. The second place we would be able to, and sorry, just to bring that back to the Lockheed Martin Cyberkill Chain, this would be protecting you at the delivery level, coming into your network, delivering into your network. Once the Ryuk ransomware is on your system, the ransomware has specific behaviors that it will exhibit, which will allow you to identify that it's in your network and catch it or protect against it as it's moving through your network. So a big thing with Ryuk is that it uses these wake online packets. So these packets allow the attacker to wake up any turned off machines and then turn them on, and then further use a RPC command to execute some malicious code and then spread itself onto other devices in the system. How we can protect against this is by looking at these wake on LAN packets and ensuring that we're alerting administrators whenever we see this activity going on in the network. And even if you use wake on LAN packets in your network, it's good to ensure that you know when the wake on LAN packets are being sent and from where to where, because you're going to know what your network looks like. You're going to know what's suspicious activity in your network. So ensuring that any wake on LAN packets are alerted by the intrusion detection and protection system allows you to take a look at these alerts and say, oh, this is a wake on LAN packet coming from our accountant's computer. That seems quite odd. And then further take action on that. So taking a look at these wake on LAN packets, we're able to write a IDPS rule, which will match on the content in this packet and then alert us. So first, we're going to look for a pattern that we can use to identify them. So we can see that each packet, side by side, the two pictures, start with 6 characters of hex value FF, and then continue on with 16 repetitions of the same 6 characters over and over. So to write a rule for that, let me jump back into the Crystal Eye. We can go into our IDPS section in the Crystal Eye, click IDPS rules, and under local rules, we can add a rule. So here's where we're going to be adding IDPS rules. So let's name it something. Let's say wake on LAN. And let's say the message is wake on LAN observed. It's a UDP packet. We'll make sure that it's alerting because we don't want to drop any packets from real wake on LAN packets. Let's say the source network is any, because it can be coming from internal or external. The attacker could already be in your network. And the source port will be any. The destination is going to be the home network, and the destination port is going to be 7, which is the port that wake on LAN accepts packets. And under this content keyword field, we're able to add any matches on content within the packet to identify whether or not wake on LAN packets are being sent. So I've prepared this little string earlier. And this is a regex rule, which matches on content in the packet. I'll zoom in so you can see it better. And I'll just run through what this regex string does. So the regex string looks for those 6 instances of the FF hex character that we saw earlier. And then it matches on 6 instances of any character repeated 15 extra times. So it has those 6 FF characters and then the 6 repeated characters over 16 times, which is how many times it's repeated. So we can add this. And when someone makes a wake on LAN packet request, we will be able to see it in our security dashboard under the IDPS alerts section, just down here, as well as under the report section under IDPS rules. Cool. As you may have noticed, you might want to allow some wake on LAN packets, but block certain wake on LAN packets. So say if a wake on LAN packet, once again, bringing back to the earlier point, is coming from your accountant's desktop, you probably want to block that all the time. There's not really many instances that a wake on LAN packet is going to be sent from your accountant's machine. We can block those instances by using the firewall. Using this custom firewall rule, we can go into traffic rules and click add. And here is where we can add custom firewall rules. So in the new version of Crystal Eye, we have a feature which allows you to add certain groups of IPs, certain groups of assets, and create firewall rules based on that. So under advanced settings, in objects, you can actually create groups and make sure the firewall rules match on this. So because we don't have any assets set up on this machine, we only have the default groups. But say this was non-admin IP host group. So all of the IPs of non-admin assets on the network. We can then say that any UDP packets coming from that source to the destination port 7 on any non, let's say this is this is admin or non-admin, any IPs, we can then block those requests by going down here and clicking reject. So this will allow you to block any wake on LAN packets coming from non-admin IPs. And it's quite useful to group those IPs and make sure that we're blocking like that. Cool. Just jumping back to the PowerPoint. So here we can see that wake on LAN packet is once again blocking on the delivery aspect of the ransomware, but this time more focusing on the internal delivery once it's on a machine delivering between your assets. Continuing on, I'm going to look at NAT Slip Streaming, which is a new network attack that was detailed sometime or late last year, October. And this is a attack method that allows attackers to create direct connections to internal IPs. It is a two-stage attack. It first enumerates the valid internal IPs, either by using image tags on a web page to request images from internal IPs, or using other methods. And then it uses those internal IPs and sends a HTTP packet to the vulnerable asset to allow it to connect to that internal IP. This attack is mainly exploiting a issue that is present in the NAT implementation of NAT's implementation of application layer gateways for a couple of services. We're going to be focusing on SIP, the Session Initiation Protocol, which is often used in VoIP or video conferencing. So taking a look at the packets that are sent to SIP normally, it looks like this. You may notice that this looks relatively similar or quite similar to a HTTP packet. It has the action here and then a bunch of headers and header options. HTTP packets are the same. You can have a post request, a get request, and a bunch of headers as well. The issue with this exploit is that it's sending HTTP packets to the vulnerable service, so to SIP on port 5060. We can see an example of this exploit in use here. It's quite a detailed annotation of the exploit, but at the top you can see that it's a post request, a HTTP request to port 5060, and it is making a post sending a web form which has a bunch of repeated characters to split the request into 3 packets, and then the third packet is a pure SIP packet making a register request to 5060. Now, this third packet is the big issue and the big thing that we're going to be matching on. If we see a HTTP post request that includes a SIP packet within it, that looks quite odd. Furthermore, if we see a HTTP request to a non-standard HTTP port, so something that doesn't really support HTTP, so once again, the SIP protocol on 5060, we can also block on that. So first I'm going to be looking at an IDPS rule that implements blocking this request. So I'll just jump back on the Crystal Eye. Here we go. we'll go back to our IDPS section under IDPS rules and add a new local rule. We'll name this NAT Slip Streaming. And we'll say the message is NAT Slip Streaming observed. Okay, so this is going to be a TCP, sorry, no, not a TCP request, a HTTP request from a source network outside of the outside of your internal network from any port to within our network, so our home network, on specifically 5060. And we're going to see that the HTTP request is sending a post which has the content of a SIP request. So it's a HTTP post request with any SIP headers in it. So you can match on as many SIP headers as you want. I'm just going to match on one, which is this via header that states via SIP 2.0 TCP. Cool. So this will look for any HTTP post requests that have this content within it, a SIP header. And if we add that, it will now alert us whenever there is a SIP, a HTTP packet with SIP content being sent to 5060. Now, we can also implement protection for this in the firewall, once again, by adding a traffic rule that looks at the destination of 5060 and a protocol of TCP coming in from an external port. And then we can alert on that to say this is a SIP request coming in from an external port, external IP. You might want to take a look at it. You probably don't want to block it because if you're using VoIP, that might be a valid protocol request. So just keep that in mind. Okay. To bring that back to the Lockheed Martin Cyberkill Chain, this is going to be looking at the exploitation part of the Cyberkill Chain. Because it's not malware, it's an exploit. It doesn't quite fit into this kill chain, but this can be used to exploit a vulnerability, which it is, to further gain access and install, say, ransomware or malware into the system. Cool. So next, let's look at Cobalt Strike, which is a post-exploitation kit used by a lot of red teams. And this tool is especially interesting in that it, one, has things called beacons, which allow for malleable C2 communication, and it allows attackers, external attackers, to run commands on the system, sort of like a Metasploit shell. And then also, Cobalt Strike generates shellcode for your system, or for a system. If you give it some parameters, say this system is running Java or such and such, it will generate some shellcode that you can run on the system and download these beacons from, and you can plug this into a existing exploit to get Cobalt Strike onto the system. So we're going to be looking at blocking both of those. Okay, and once again, we're going to bring it back to the Cyberkill Chain. But first, let's take a look at the shellcode generated by Cobalt Strike. So this shellcode has a pattern. It might not be completely apparent because it's a bunch of hex characters, but both of these shellcodes start with the hex characters FC, E8, 89, and 3 null characters, or 00 characters. That's something we can match on. It's a common, It's a common behavior between the two generated shellcodes that we can use to match. So let's do that through IDPS rules once again. I'll jump into the Crystal Eye. And let's go back to our IDPS section, go into rules, and let's add a new rule. We'll call this Cobalt Strike and say Cobalt Strike beacon download shellcode observed. And this is going to be coming from any protocol, but let's focus on TCP for now. The source network can be any. If you want to narrow it down to external to avoid any false positives, you can. It's going to be coming to any, coming from any port, coming to any asset in the network on any port. Because this is a shellcode that you plug into any existing exploit that the attacker has, so it can be used with anything. Now, let's identify that we have those repeating bytes at the start of the of each shellcode, FCE889, and let's just match on that. So here we just have a basic match. These bars, pipes, identify that this is hex characters, and we're just matching on these. Cool. And we can add that, and it will now alert whenever we see those hex characters in a TCP request to our network. Let's go back to the slides and take a look at where we're protecting the network on the Cyberkill chain. This is going to be looking at the weaponization of the shellcode and then blocking it at the delivery point. So it's sort of both, if you think about it. It's blocking you when it's being delivered. Cool. Let's take a look at the next part, which is a C2 communication that the beacon has. The beacon, when it's sent a command from the attacker, will send back a HTTP GET request, which has no content. It has quite a few interesting headers, like accept star, and what else? Content 0. It doesn't have a referrer, but the big thing is that it has this cookie, which is a base 64 string. This is how Cobalt Strike is exfiltrating the information that it's obtained through the command that's run out of your network. And we can use this to write a regex rule to match on a cookie that has base 64, a base 64 string, and then also has those weird headers like accept star / and no referrer. So
Okay, we seem to have lost Braden there. You bear with us for just a second. We'll see if we can get Braden back online and see if we can pick up from where we were.
Continuing on where I left off.
Are you there, Braden?
Let's go back to
back.
our IDPS
right.
rules.
That's right, over to
the
you.
Crystal Eye, and create a rule to block on this C2 communication. All right, so click on IDPS rules, and under local rules, we'll add one. And now we can add a rule that looks at the HTTP request made to from any port, from our internal network on any port to the external network on any port. And let's take a look at the content that we're matching on. So first, we know that it's a GET request, and we have sticky bit that looks at the start of the HTTP request. Sticky buffer. And so here that is, and then it matches on the content. That is HTTP 1.1, accept star and cookie. So relatively straightforward. And now we have a regex rule that matches on after cookie. It will look for any base64 string. And then we can take a look at the HTTP header names and say that it doesn't include a referrer. Cool. So let's just name that, let's say Cobalt Strike beacon, and say beacon observed. We can add that, and now anytime a packet that looks like that was sent from inside our network to outside of our network, we will have an alert to tell us that that has happened. Relating this back to the Cyberkill chain, this is going to be looking at the command and control section of the Cyberkill chain, exfiltrating information and ensuring that we're blocking any exfiltration of the information. Cool, and that about wraps it up for the run through of protecting your network against the specific attacks. Do we have any questions?
So before we have questions, I just want to point out a few things here. With regards to rule creation, this is something, obviously, we seem fairly comfortable with it on our side. It's part of the daily operations of the SOC team. So managed rules, threat hunting, creating rules and testing these as part of our day-to-day process are pushed out to the Crystallize as part of the basic license. So knowing that we have a team that's actively searching for these threats, creating the rules and testing them at different capacities and at different stages of that kill chain. We might have a Trojan, for example, we might have 5 or 10 rules for that, specifically around the delivery, around its communication, receiving commands, transmitting passwords. All of these can be different rules that let us know at what point of the kill chain a particular machine is being attacked at. The second thing is that the training, this training session itself will be made available through the training platform in Orchestrate. So if you did want to review this training after the case, you can go back into Orchestrate and click through to watch the training. It should be available, I imagine, within a week or so. But with that said, let's open this up to questions. There's been a few in the chat already.
Yeah, so one of them that's popped up, probably not very related to threat hunting, but it's more of like a general thing. So Antonio asks, how do we upgrade our current devices? This is pretty straightforward. Braden, if you could pull up your Crystal Eye appliance again, we'll just quickly point out where we do our software upgrades. Fantastic. All right, so we do software upgrades. So all of our applications are upgraded automatically. So we push updates to the applications. But when it comes to the main operating system itself, so when we go to Crystal Eye XDR 4.0, it will show up under System Configuration, Software Updates, and you'll see the option there. So currently running version 3.8. And you will see when, so you guys are on 3.5, so you will see version 4.0 become available there, and then you just simply set it as your default operating system. So this is one of the really great things that I'm really impressed with these Crystal Eye appliances, is that when it comes to changing your operating system, like a major update, it is something you can flip a switch on. So you can go back to 3.5 if you want to. So you can keep the old version there just in case you need to roll things back. And it's really it doesn't mean that you have to do that dance of trying to make a configuration work with a previous version of the firmware like you do with our competing products. So yeah, that's how you upgrade your current devices. It's just a software upgrade, and it will be coming at the end of March. So by the 1st of April, we should have this available to you. Any other questions?
I see one from Samir here. Limit to the number of rules that can be created and set in XDR. Currently, we have no limit. I believe the number of rules we have as part of our managed rule set is sitting at around 40,000 at present, which is actually already very massive. But the thing to consider with rules is not so much the number of them, as much as the performance impact that particular rules might have. When you start tying together multiple regular expressions, tracking packets and data streams that are long and require many backwards and forths between the server and the client, at that point you create a performance overhead. So the rules that we create, we try and bring in, as Braden had done, that the smallest amount of unique bits within that network stream to identify that particular malware without creating false positives. So I believe you had one, Braden, that had a cookie that was base 64 encoded, and it contained no referrer. We know that a cookie is a limited size. The regex to match base 64 is actually quite simple, as opposed to other regex that you might be able to create. So just to keep in mind, you can create thousands of rules if you wish to, but specifically when you're using things like regular expressions, this can have a performance detriment. So just be careful when doing that.
Okay, now I don't think we've seen any other questions pop up, so that's the two questions that have been asked have been answered. If anyone's got any other questions, now is a great time to ask. All right, and it looks like everyone seems to be happy. Oh, hang on. All right, so another one from Samir. Can we integrate third-party UTM or XDR? This was also discussed with Anish earlier. So what are the levels of reporting that can be sent to the XDR? Sounds like a James question.
Okay, this is the use of UTM and XDR. Is obviously they're similar, but there are some differences there in the detection and response capabilities. It's very difficult to know exactly what you're getting at here, but just as a basic thing, the Crystal Eye XDR can be put on the span port to receive traffic that's duplicated from an existing UTM solution. But with regards to monitoring the logs that are part of the UTM itself through syslog or some other capacity, I believe that will be coming to Crystal Eye at some point in the future. So things like managed switches, routers, anything that's able to produce syslogs, not just UTM devices, will be able to ingest that into the Crystal Eye and thereby transfer those logs onto the SOC for monitoring and the response capabilities. But it's important to consider where the overlap is here. Crystal Eye will work best when it is the primary gateway device. There may be certain considerations that need to be made with regards to where you put it and whether or not it can replace existing devices. So we do have that capacity for the span port configuration off the side, but for the response capability, particularly around the digital forensics component, the packet capturing and the vulnerability scans, the PCAPs can be run on span port. The vulnerability scans can run in that configuration, but the IDPS engine cannot block when it is in that span port configuration. And given that the protective capability of Crystal Eye is primarily concerned around IDPS, firewall, DNS block list, you want to make use of as many features there as you can, because they all chain together. All the logs and all the information that we gather from each of those components works together to give you that level of protection. So yes, we can in a roundabout way, but this will depend on which UTM, what's your configuration, what's the network, where are you putting the crystal eye, and whether or not this is actually the best solution for you. Does that answer the question, Samir?
Okay, yep, so Samir seems to be happy with that. Thank you very much for your response there, Samir. Okay, a last call for any questions. We'll give you guys maybe a few seconds to just pop a question in there. Otherwise, we're pretty close to done. All right. Okay, so we'll assume that there are no more questions. Guys, thanks for joining us, and hopefully you'll come away with a deeper understanding of protecting your networks with Crystal Eye XDR. Now, this session, there are replays for this over the next 24 hours, and attendees will also get a link from Demio for the recorded session. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks again for taking an interest in Red Piranha, and we look forward to seeing you again in the very near future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.